Welcome to the Deep Dive. We know you're curious, looking to get smart about complex topics efficiently.
And we try to help by digging into the source materials you send our way.
Exactly. Today, we're tackling, well, a massive question. The nature of consciousness itself.
And we're zeroing in on it through the pretty fascinating lens of near-death experiences, or NDEs.
Yeah, and our main source here, provided by you listeners, is an interview with Dr. Pim van Lommel.
Right, he's a Dutch cardiologist, did this really extensive research on NDEs, for decades.
And importantly, his findings weren't just, fringe ideas. They were published in The Lancet.
A huge deal in the medical world. And his book, Consciousness Beyond Life, cemented him as, well, a leading authority, really.
Definitely. So the core question we're wrestling with today, which comes straight from van Lommel's work, is this. Is consciousness just a byproduct of brain activity? Or is there something more going on?
And van Lommel's own journey is kind of central to this. He didn't start out thinking this way at all.
Not at all. As a young cardiologist, he was very much a materialist, believed the brain was everything when it came to consciousness. Simple as that.
But then something happened early in his career, right? Something that planted a seed of doubt?
Yeah, exactly. He was working in a coronary care unit, resuscitated a patient after a cardiac arrest. Pretty standard stuff for him.
Okay.
But this patient, afterwards, described this incredibly vivid NDE. The classic elements, a tunnel, seeing a bright light, hearing music, even feeling like they were in this beautiful landscape.
Wow. So right at the coalface, basically.
Right. And he noted it down, found it striking, but maybe didn't fully grasp the implications then.
It took a while to sink in.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
It wasn't until years later, maybe around 1986, he said, after he read George Ritchie's Return from Tomorrow and Raymond Moody's Life After Life.
Ah, the foundational NDE books.
Exactly. Reading those made him think back to that early patient. He realized it wasn't just some isolated weird event.
So that prompted him to actually start asking other patients.
Yeah, but informally at first. He just started asking his cardiac arrest survivors, did you remember anything from when you were unconscious?
And what did he find? Was it common?
Surprisingly so, I think, for him. Out of the first 50 patients he asked, 12 reported having an NDE.
12 out of 50, that's significant, nearly a quarter.
It really is. And that's where his scientific training kicked in. Because, the standard neuroscience view is brain stops, consciousness stops, full stop.
Right. So how could people be having these incredibly detailed emotional experiences, sometimes even feeling like they're floating outside their body when their brain is supposedly offline?
Exactly. It was a puzzle.
Yeah.
A direct challenge to prevailing model.
Yeah.
And it couldn't just be dismissed as, hallucinations or drug effects without proper investigation.
Which clearly hadn't been done rigorously enough, at least not prospectively. Most studies before were looking back years later sometimes.
Right, relying on memory, open to all sorts of bias. So van Lommel thought, we need to do this properly, prospectively.
And that led to his big study.
That's the one, a really ambitious project. Over 4 years, across 10 different hospitals in the Netherlands.
Wow.
They followed 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest, documented everything close to the event.
And then they followed up? Yeah.
Follow-up interviews at 2 years, and then again at 8 years.
Yeah.
Crucially, comparing the ones who had NDEs with those who didn't, but still survived the cardiac arrest.
That comparative element is key, isn't it, to isolate the effects of the NDE itself?
Absolutely. So let's dig into what they found. A really common explanation you hear for NDEs is anoxia, lack of oxygen to the brain. Makes sense on the surface, right? Brain's starved, it does weird things.
Seems plausible. What did the study show?
Well, surprisingly, no significant link. They looked at how long the cardiac arrest lasted, how severe the oxygen deprivation was, whether patients were in a coma for a long time.
No correlation?
Nope. The likelihood of having an NDE didn't seem to depend on the severity or duration of the anoxia.
So even patients with relatively short cardiac arrests could have one, and those with long ones might not.
Exactly. And they even looked at induced cardiac arrests, during certain surgeries where things are more controlled. Still saw NDEs reported.
Okay, so that really undermines the simple anoxia explanation. What about psychological factors, like maybe it's just intense fear of dying, or people who already knew about NDEs were more likely to report them?
They looked into that too.
Okay.
Again, mostly no strong links. Cardiac arrest is usually sudden, right? So pre-existing fear wasn't necessarily a factor.
Right, it hits you out of the blue.
And they didn't find significant differences based on religious belief or education level or whether people had heard about NDEs before.
Any differences at all?
Well, a couple of interesting demographic points. Younger patients seem slightly more likely to report NDEs, and women tended to describe deeper experiences, maybe with more elements included.
Okay, but those don't really explain why the NDE happens in the first place. What about medication? Could the drugs given during resuscitation cause these experiences?
Another common thought, but no. The study found no correlation with the specific medications used either.
So the usual suspects, lack of oxygen, fear, prior knowledge, drugs, none of them seem to hold up under scrutiny in this large prospective study.
Pretty much, yeah. Which brings us to the long-term effects. Van Lommel talks about finding, quote, objective proof of what is ultimately a subjective experience. What does he mean by that?
That's really about the transformation people go through afterwards. It's one of the most consistent findings in his longitudinal data. People who had NDEs showed these profound, lasting changes.
Like what specifically?
The biggest one, often, is losing the fear of death. Completely or almost completely. It just evaporates for many of them.
Wow, that alone is huge.
It is. But also changes in life attitude. Increased empathy, more compassion, feeling much more connected to other people, to nature. That kind of enhanced intuition, too. And these weren't just fleeting feelings, they lasted. Years later, at the 8-year follow-up, these changes were still evident.
And crucially, this transformation wasn't seen in the control group, the cardiac arrest survivors who didn't have an NDE.
Precisely. That's the key point. The control group went through the same medical trauma, the cardiac arrest, but they didn't show these specific long-term shifts in the same way or with the same consistency.
So Van Lommel argues that this distinct, enduring change linked only to the NDE group is a kind of objective marker, evidence that something very real and impactful happened during that experience.
Exactly. It's not just the story they tell, it's how their lives change afterwards in measurable ways documented over time. He sees that as strong evidence against dismissing NDEs as mere fantasy or delusion.
Okay, but the scientific establishment hasn't universally embraced this. There are still counter-arguments, right? Like, aren't these just complex hallucinations? Or maybe some brain cells are still firing?
Yeah, he addresses those directly. The hallucination argument, he says, well, it runs into the problem of needing a functioning brain, particularly the cortex.
Right, because during cardiac arrest, brain activity shuts down really fast. The EEG goes flat within seconds.
Within 10 to 20 seconds, typically. So how do you have a complex, structured narrative experience like an NDE with no global cortical activity? Physiologically, it seems, well, improbable, to say the least.
And the idea of just a few surviving cells keeping consciousness going.
He argues that complex consciousness, the kind with self-awareness, memory, emotion, coherent perception, that requires a coordinated network, a global neuronal workspace. Isolated pockets of firing cells just wouldn't cut it, wouldn't produce that kind of integrated experience.
Makes sense. What about activity deeper in the brain, like the brainstem? Could that be responsible even if the cortex is offline?
That's another point he tackles. He mentions animal studies where during induced cardiac arrest, they couldn't even stimulate the brainstem, suggesting it was non-functional. And clinically, in humans during cardiac arrest, doctors check for brainstem reflexes, pupil response to light, gag reflex, breathing. Those are typically absent.
Yeah, lack of breathing and fixed pupils are classic signs.
Right. So the clinical picture also suggests the brainstem isn't functioning either. He feels these counter-arguments often ignore the actual physiological state during cardiac arrest.
Which then brings us to maybe the most challenging evidence for the materialist view. These veridical out-of-body experiences. People reporting things they couldn't possibly have known through normal senses.
Yeah, these are really powerful anecdotes, if corroborated. Van Lommel has a particularly striking example.
The denture story.
That's the one. This man was found unconscious, CPR in the field, brought into the ER, basically clinically dead. No heartbeat, no breathing, pupils fixed and dilated, total lack of brain function by all standard measures.
Okay.
During the resuscitation chaos, a nurse took out his upper dentures to help intubate him, and she put them on the crash cart, the trolley with all the equipment.
Right, just place them aside.
Exactly. The patient was eventually revived, but remained in a coma for about a week. When he finally woke up, he started talking about the resuscitation.
What did he say?
He described the room, the people, and crucially, he described seeing the nurse take out his dentures and place them on that specific card, even noting some other details about it.
While he was clinically dead, with no apparent brain function.
Correct. There was no way he could have seen that physically. The nurse later confirmed his account was completely accurate. She remembered exactly where she put them.
That's pretty hard to explain away.
It really is. And van Lommel stresses this isn't unique. He mentions other documented cases corroborated by staff or families, sometimes collected in books. These veridical accounts, where details are later verified, are a major puzzle piece.
So if the brain isn't producing consciousness, how does van Lommel see the relationship? What's his model?
He uses analogies. Think of a TV set and the TV program being broadcast, or a computer and the internet.
Okay, so the brain is the hardware.
Sort of. The brain is like the receiver, the interface. It receives, processes, maybe even filters consciousness, but it doesn't create it.
And then consciousness itself is.
Yeah. He proposes it's non-local, meaning it's not confined to the brain or even the body. It exists outside of space and time, fundamentally, always there.
Wow. So the brain is just tuning into it, like a radio tuning into a signal.
That's a good way to put it. And this model helps explain things like NDEs. The signal persists even when the receiver, the brain, is down. It also helps understand sleep or anesthesia. The receiver's function is just altered. It's not receiving the signal in the same way.
And brain damage.
It affects how that non-local consciousness is expressed or experienced through the physical body, our waking consciousness, but it doesn't destroy the fundamental consciousness itself. Like damaging the TV affects the picture, but not the broadcast.
Interesting. So beyond NDEs, does he point to other phenomena that might support this idea of consciousness existing beyond the brain?
He does, yeah. He touches on several related areas, things like end-of-life experiences or deathbed visions.
Where dying people see deceased relatives or have moments of clarity.
Exactly. Enhanced awareness, visions. Studies apparently show these are quite common. Then there's terminal lucidity.
Ah, I've heard of that. People with severe dementia, like Alzheimer's, suddenly becoming clear-headed right before they die.
Yes. Suddenly recognizing loved ones, speaking coherently after maybe years of being unable to. It's unexpected and hard to explain if the brain damage is supposed to be irreversible.
What else?
He mentions premortal experiences, knowing someone has died the moment it happens, even far away. And shared death experiences.
What are those?
Where people at the bedside of someone dying feel like they share part of the experience, seeing a light, feeling a presence leave, sometimes even getting glimpses of a life review or tunnel themselves.
And finally,
after-death communication, people feeling they've had contact with loved ones who have passed away, often in dreams, but dreams that feel incredibly real and leave a lasting impact.
So it's a whole cluster of phenomena that seem to point in a similar direction, away from a strictly brain-based model.
That's the argument, yeah, that collectively these experiences suggest consciousness is more expansive than we typically assume.
Which makes you wonder, with all this evidence, the prospective study, the transformations, the veridical reports, these related phenomena, why is there still so much resistance in mainstream science?
Well, van Lommel offers a few thoughts. Science is inherently conservative, which isn't always bad, but it can make challenging established paradigms difficult.
People worry about their reputation, funding.
Absolutely. Rocking the boat can have professional consequences. He also talks about maybe a kind of willful ignorance, a reluctance to even engage with evidence that contradicts the dominant materialist framework. Prejudice, perhaps?
It takes time for big shifts to happen in science.
Definitely. He quotes Max Planck, the physicist, who basically said science advances one funeral at a time. New ideas often aren't accepted because opponents change their minds, but because they eventually die off and a new generation grows up familiar with the new ideas.
A somewhat cynical view, but perhaps realistic. It sounds like this whole journey really changed van Lommel personally, too.
Oh, profoundly. He describes it as a gradual shift over many years, digesting the evidence. It significantly impacted his and his wife's life.
How so?
They became vegetarians, focused on organic food, connecting with nature, cultivating inner peace. It wasn't just intellectual, it reshaped their whole way of living and seeing the world.
So what's the ultimate takeaway message from his work? What's the big picture he's painting?
I think the core idea is that consciousness is fundamental, not just secondary to matter. If consciousness comes first, then our subjective experience, our inner world, is incredibly important.
It shifts the focus.
Completely. It emphasizes interconnectedness. We're all part of this larger consciousness. And that naturally leads to valuing things like love, empathy, compassion, and of course the idea that consciousness continues after physical death.
It's a very different view of reality than the standard one.
Radically different. He believes embracing this view is vital, moving us beyond just materialism towards something more holistic.
And after all this research, decades of it, how does he personally feel about death now?
He says he doesn't fear it anymore, not at all. Instead, he feels curious, just curious to know what happens next.
So wrapping up this deep dive, Dr. van Lommel's work, particularly his large prospective study, really does pose a serious challenge to the idea that consciousness is purely a product of the brain.
Yeah, the data on NDEs, the lack of correlation with physiological factors like anoxia, the long-term transformations, the veridical reports, it all points towards consciousness potentially being independent of the physical body.
The implications are huge, obviously, for how we understand life, death, maybe even the fabric of reality.
It certainly pushes the boundaries and invites us, maybe even compels us, to reconsider that fundamental relationship between mind and matter.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on. If consciousness is more fundamental, more expansive than just brain chemistry, as van Lommel's research suggests, could truly embracing that perspective change us? Could it shift our societal values away from pure materialism towards something different? What might that look like? Something to ponder.
Definitely food for thought.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We really encourage you to look into Dr. van Lommel's work, if this sparked your interest.